welcome to the NT podcast, Science and Theology podcast, the best channel in the Balkans in the field of bridging science and theology together. So my name is Nemanja Jurišić, and today we have a special guest, Dr. Rabbi Joshua Berman. Dr. Berman, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Nemanja. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you pronounced it quite correctly because for many people it is a little hard to say Nemanja or something like that. But
Oh well, I
you said,
I I I
yeah.
heard you introduce yourself first, so that helped. I have to admit.
Okay. Okay, so thanks for coming. I really appreciate your expertise on this topic because we will today talk about the documentary hypothesis. That's a really famous theory of composition of Pentateuch. You have many books on that topic, so this is your really big field. And do you want to say something about your biography or what projects are you working on and promote your books or anything? So for people who don't know you, maybe.
Well, okay, so as you can tell, I'm American originally. I live in Israel. I've lived here for 37 years. I came on Aliyah, that means to move to Israel, right after I finished my BA at Princeton. And I'm a professor of Tanakh at Bar-Ilan University, and I'm also a rabbi. I'm an Orthodox rabbi. I've kind of lived my entire life in two worlds, religious and not religious. I wasn't raised in a religious home. I studied for 8 years in a yeshiva. That's like a rabbinic seminary, obviously totally religious, but studying university, obviously not religious necessarily. So like bridging these worlds is like kind of what I've been trying to do my entire life.
Yes, amazing. Thank you so much. And I have about 10 questions for you, Dr. Berman. And let's start with the first. What is the origin of source criticism? Does it have any anti-Semitic roots? Is it a coincidence that the documentary hypothesis emerged in the same countries that later led to Nazi Germany?
I actually don't believe that there's much of a connection, only a slight connection. Let me explain. Um, uh, the earliest source critics, that is, the first people to make kind of like a division between, let's say, the name of God, Yahweh, and the name of God, Elohim. Um, uh, I think that was even already in the 18th century. These were people who were very devout and they were not coming. They had no inkling anything against Jews. There were only two sources at the time. Over time, obviously, that grew to be four sources. The same type of scholars that were doing this to the Bible were also doing this to Homer and classical literature. And I don't think that those German scholars of the 18th and 19th centuries were anti-Grecian any more than they were anti. They might have been. They certainly were to some degree anti-Semitic, but the fact that they were doing exactly the same moves of splitting the text, trying to find sources, that wasn't born out of anti-Semitism because they were doing this to the Greek sources as well. It was out of a desire to create history, because history can only come if you know the sources. That was the purpose in doing this, so that we could have a history of Israel, we could have a history of Greece, etc. Um, that said, I would say that once the foundations of the documentary hypothesis were in place, you can begin to see some anti-Semitic winds filtering in. For example, Wellhausen's famous statement that when he read that Graf put the priestly source last, and by last that means priestly source is very legal, okay, and by putting it last for Wellhausen, that meant that it was a period of decline. That the great period of Israelite religious history was the prophets and their soaring spirit, and law and legal things, which obviously a good Protestant at the time might have thought, well, that's outdated, that's Old Testament, Jewish, if you will. So all of that he kind of affiliated with decline. And so you get a little bit of, something that you might be able to characterize as influenced by anti-Semitism. Um, yeah, I would say that that's basically it. I think that there's one place, if I recall, in Wellhausen's main work, the Prolegomena, to the history of Israel. I believe that he says there are chapters in the Book of Chronicles when David is about to pass away and he's passing on the reins to Solomon. And there are several chapters in which he instructs Solomon about how to build the temple and about the preparations that he, David, made for building the temple. And there's a long listing of materials that David gathered to build the temple. And to that, Wellhausen says, well, so I'm paraphrasing, but it's not far off what I'm about to say. Well, only Jews could be so caught up in lists of valuable things. So that's pretty anti-Semitic. But that's one comment in a work of many hundreds of pages. So I think that many of these scholars, probably if you read widely or if you had interviewed them, were probably anti-Semitic, but probably no more or less so than many other German intellectuals of the 19th century. And I don't think that the enterprise of coming up with sources was anti-Semitic per se.
Okay, thanks for clarification because we
Hmm.
don't want to strawman those people for sure. So,
Hmm. Right.
yeah, and why is there such a strong consensus on this hypothesis, even about 400 years or something like that? So, yeah.
Oh, I don't believe that consensus exists anymore. Look, in the 1920s, certainly, and there are scholars that write this explicitly. Either you believe in the four documents of the Torah, you're not a scholar. Like that is just those are the only two choices. Um, um, but even today, I would say that most German scholars that I know don't necessarily adhere any longer to four sources. They have sources, but they'll have different models, what are called supplementary models. You know, there was like core, and then things developed, things added on, but not the J, E, P, and D. That, of course, does still have adherence in different and modified forms, but I wouldn't say that that is the consent. It might be the consensus. Well, certainly within a certain school of Pentateuch scholars. I'm not even sure if four sources is the consensus within all Pentateuch scholars. And once you take all Bible scholars, because Bible scholars write about a lot of things, right? Not just the Pentateuch. I don't think that it would be accurate anymore to say that the idea of four strands, four sources woven together, that's what creates the Torah. I don't know if that's the consensus anymore. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, but why should we even consider opinion of other people that are out of source criticism field? Because their opinion, according to some people, is not important because they are not trained to think like that. So they cannot even recognize those sources as those who study source criticism. So do you agree with that? That professors of Hebrew, of Old Testament, of Daniel, or anything, can they even study this topic?
Yeah, I think they can study the topic better than source critics can. Meaning, you know, it's very interesting in mind. If you go and look for, so let's say you wanted to study source criticism, okay? You go around and look for a book that teaches you how to do this. They are few and far between. It's a methodologically, I would say, lacking field. That find where, what are the underlying presuppositions of it? Why and how did they come to be? How do we know at a given point whether something belongs to this source or to that source? What is the control for our methodology? Extremely important. Extremely important. Let me explain what I mean by that, by control. Um, um, it, it, you always want to know that the methodology that you're using is either proven or is used widely by others in other fields. That is, in chemistry, if you have chemists in different fields of chemistry, but they're using basically the same methodologies, then you can use it too. Okay. My point here is that there are many ancient texts that we have today as academics. We have texts from Egypt, and we have texts from Greece, and we have texts from Mesopotamia, and we have texts from the Hittite Empire, and all over. Okay, and if you watch how scholars, academic scholars, right, address and dissect and analyze ancient texts from all over the world, None of them use the same rules that source critics use to analyze the Pentateuch. And so that already should raise a flag. Like why is that? Why is there a special methodology only for the Pentateuch? I mentioned earlier that in the 19th century, certainly in the late 18th century, scholars were doing exactly the same type of operations and analyses of classical literature, sources and doublets and contradictions, etc. And they found them galore. They found them galore in Greek literature, just like they found them galore in the Torah. But a strange thing happened around the turn of the 20th century. Greek scholar or classical scholars lost interest in source criticism. But in Pentateuchal criticism, they didn't. There's an historian, a Yale historian, who claimed that the reason that this type of scholarship fell out of fashion with regard to Greek literature as opposed to Pentateuchal literature is the following. In the first place, he said, the reason that German scholars were so eager to analyze classics and the Bible is because classics and the Bible were the cornerstones of culture, right? In other words, once upon a time, classics was something, every educated child in Germany would receive a training in classics. They would learn Greek and they would learn Latin, right? Maybe you even know some people who maybe when they were younger, but no one your age, Nemanja, learns Greek and Latin, just unless they really like went out of their way to study it. But nobody learns Greek and Latin that or that I know, as just part of their basic high school education. That is like long, long gone. So these source critics, both for classics and for the Pentateuch, this is the claim, wanted to demonstrate they are the ones who have the keys to understanding these cornerstones of culture, the classics, the Bible. What happened at the turn of the 20th century is that people lost interest in the classics generally. The classics went from being a cornerstone of culture to being an academic field, like Egyptology or like Assyriology, because there's really nobody today who delves much or thinks much about classics who isn't in a classics department in a university. Okay, so now that it was no longer these works, classics were no longer so important. It was no longer so important to demonstrate mastery over them, and so they realized the enterprise for what it really was, not sufficiently based. That it's really not possible to take a text and without any corroborating exterior evidence say we're going to take the final form of the text as we have it before us, which has undergone copies and copies and copies, but we're going to dissect it and then move back and say, you see, this is what part A looked like, this is what part B looked like. They realize you can't do that. But because the Bible, at the turn of the 20th century and even to this day, continues to play a great role in culture, there are many people who read the Bible, even if they're not in a university. In fact, most people who engage the Bible in this world today are not in a university, but it has an enormous impact, right? There's all these culture wars, and especially in places like the United States, all sorts of laws, abortion and school education, you name it. Religion is a really potent force. And so this is why in my opinion, I don't think that this is a conscious thing, but I think that this is why, as a discipline in biblical studies, this paradigm remains, whereas in classics, it went by the wayside over 100 years ago. Now, this is not to say that all source critics are atheists, anti-religious. I know very, very religious source critics. Okay. I'm analyzing it from a much higher view, a macro view, historically looking at trends over the last 200 years. Okay, so I don't think that I think I have an inkling that there are some source critics that I know. When you discover that they are lapsed Christians or are having a hard time with God, which is fine. I don't, maybe they had a difficult life and that's fine. And I don't judge anybody, God forbid. But I don't think that's really what's animating most source critics. I think most source critics were probably raised and trained in a certain environment that intuitively makes sense because source criticism is predicated on Aristotelian poetics, which even if you've never read Aristotle, but you just live in the West, this is the air you breathe. And so it's not an accident that we see things and then we say, oh, that is a contradiction. Oh, that is a repetition, a bothersome repetition. These things would have bothered Aristotle. And because classics still influences us, even though we don't know it, even if you've never read Aristotle's Poetics, that is the air you breathe. And I think that that's what's animating primarily many source critics.
Oh yeah, it makes sense. And one Rabbi Eliezer Papo from my country, he says something like that. Yeah, we will learn from Jewish history that we will not die from contradictions because it's okay to have contradictions. But for a Western mind people, it's not okay. It's big trouble and
Yeah, let me let me
instantly
let me just let me
stops.
Nemanja, let me just give an example that I think demonstrates why what I'm saying is correct. It's not just theorizing. Um, there's an Egyptian inscription called the Kaddish inscriptions of Ramses II. It's about a big war that he had, and he came back to Egypt and he plastered Egypt with copies of these inscriptions. And what we find is that on several sites, he has three different versions of this battle that he had against the Hittite Empire. And the three versions that he puts up deliberately um, contradict one another. And the reason he does that is because what he was trying to do there was to tell the story one way, in which the hero of the story would be his god, Amun, who brought salvation. And then he puts up a second version of the story with many different details to show his own valor as a fighter in the field, Ramses. And then he has a third version with yet different details that tells the story and focuses on the escapades and the valor of one of his brigades in the army. And so, in order to get out the lessons that he wanted, he needed to tell the story three times. And he told it a different way each time. And I'm quite certain that no one ever went to Ramses and said, Your Majesty, you're contradicting yourself. We don't know which is the actual factual version of what happened at the Battle of Kadesh. Nonsense. Nobody cared about that. Nobody cared about that, especially Ramses. He wanted to teach his lessons, and so you tell the story different ways. And this, friends, I'm a Jew and I'm a scholar of Old Testament, but friends, many of you who are Christian, think about this. If you've read your Gospels, then you know that there are places in the Gospels that where the story of Jesus is told a slightly different way. Where was he on at the Sermon of the Mount? What was And it can't be he was both here and here, right? So you go, oh my gosh, one of them was wrong, one of them is lying. No, no. The Gospels knew exactly what they were doing, and each one is telling the story to bring out a certain. Yeah, then there's a challenge. Why is this detail different here than here? That's an interesting question. But it was always to tell a message. And I'm certain that those that canonized the Gospels, they weren't blind. They saw these differences, but it didn't bother them.
Oh, great illustration. I like it so much. But um, how do you know that one author wrote the same three inscriptions that you mentioned?
Sure.
Please can you provide evidence.
Yeah, okay. So it's because these monuments they're part of massive temple sites that are built all at once and designed. That is to say, when a pharaoh um, 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 gives agency to build a monument or a temple, there's enormous planning that goes in. What's going to be here and what's going to. I'm saying on these walls. Walls are like, the walls of these temples and monuments are like enormous pieces of papyrus or paper. Okay, what are we going to put here? What are we going to put here? What are we going to put down here? It's all planned in advance. It's not, there's no room for what we would call a diachronic analysis. In some temples, you can clearly see, oh, the initial part of the temple was here, and then there were later additions here, different style, different kings are mentioned. Sure, that goes on. But when you see one temple complex, all built by Ramses II, like the Ramesseum in Luxor, there's no room for that. There's no room to say something like that.
Oh yeah, I was in Luxor and I saw inscriptions that are damaged and changed, but yeah, this is not the case.
Sure. That's right, because you can tell when there's been erasure, a palimpsest, things inscribed over other things. Sure, sure, there are many examples of that, but not with the inscriptions that I'm describing here.
Okay, Dr. Berman, let's ask this question. David Carr says that at least there is consensus that there is a P and non-P and at least maybe D source that is accepted by most scholars. And let's say that this is right. Does that undermine or destroy inspiration of the Bible?
Hmm.
What do you think?
Okay, so I have a friend, a source critic, a dear friend who I love dearly, and I have enormous respect for him religiously and intellectually, although I disagree with him. His name is Benjamin Summer. I have his book right here from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And he is, I guess he would describe himself as an adherent of the neo-documentary theory. He believes in four sources, and he believes that each of those sources is in some way inspired, divinely inspired. So, there's an example of someone who doesn't think that there's any contradiction in that whatsoever.
Yeah, he's a great mind. I really follow his work.
Yeah.
He's
hmm
excellent.
Yes, he is.
So, okay, you addressed this a little, but can you expand a little more? Does God in the Bible have different names and titles like Yahweh and Elohim and others? Do we find examples in the ancient Near Eastern texts where a single author uses multiple names or titles for a deity?
Absolutely. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. So there shouldn't be any surprise here as well.
Can you give any example, concrete?
Oh, let's see. I mean, I have it in the beginning of my book, Inconsistency, but all Egyptian texts, every, God is called Amun in one place and Mantu in another place, and Baal. It's in my. I mean, I can get the book. If you want me to get the book, I can open to the page. But there's
Yeah,
lots of
no need. Yeah,
inscriptions. Yeah, there's
I got sense
lots of
that there is.
inscriptions where a god is called by different names, and I think it's not just like different names. It's the different names. You'd say, well, why do the gods have different names? Like I don't know, like I have your name is Nemanja. Probably almost everybody knows you by that name. Maybe you have some type of name of endearment that your family knows you by, a nickname or something. But you don't have, six different names, You have one name, Nemanja, and I have one name, Joshua, Joshua. Okay, in Hebrew, Yoshua, it's all the same name. Why do these gods have different names? The different names often reflect different aspects. In other words, when you think of, the different powers of God, of the gods, then sometimes you refer to their different powers with different names. But it's just a fact that many texts refer to the same God with multiple names. That said, it's also important to note that in the Torah, it's not really that we have two different names. Really, the word Elohim often just functions like the word God, a small g, a god, a divinity, okay, to make it easier. Whereas the name Yahweh, or those letters Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey in Hebrew, that is truly God's name. So I'm not even sure that we have different names. Yeah.
Yeah, just titles. But Dr. Joshua, please, is it incredible or intriguing to have one name for one story of creation, of flood, or anything other, and exactly other name or title? Yeah, sorry, in the other story. So, is it argument for
Right. So
multiple
that that
sources?
that, that that's an interesting question. In other words, in Genesis 1, it just says God, small g, Elohim. Okay. Actually, the account of creation in Genesis 2, we see something that's unusual throughout the Torah. It's very unusual that we have the compound Hashem Elohim or Yahweh Elohim, if you will, together. It's not like we have one here and a different one here. What does it mean, Yahweh Elohim? That's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I'm sure many people have written about it. I'm just not up on the scholarship on that.
Yes, but when we look at, for example, first story of flood, it has allusions or echoes or any citation or quotation, I don't know, exactly from the first story. But the
Right.
second story of flood have only quotation and allusions from the second story of creation. So is that incredible?
Wait. So you're saying, let me make sure I'm understanding you because I'm not sure that I've noticed this before, but so let me make sure I'm understanding you. So there is a claim that the flood story, Genesis 6 to 9, can be split. Let's say most people say two sources, okay? A priestly source and a non-priestly source. So I am aware that those that claim that there is a priestly source to part of the or to parts of the flood story uh, point to similarities in language between those parts of the flood story and Genesis 1, which is supposedly the priestly creation account. Now, are you saying, Nemanja, that those that hold that there are these two flood stories claim that the non-P version resonates with Genesis 2? Were you saying that? I'm not familiar with that.
Yes, yes.
Hmm. Um, that's interesting. I'd have to see that inside. It could be. I think that sometimes these the splittings up they get a little tangled. In other words, there's a famous verse in the so-called non-P version, which is straight out of Genesis 1. And so scholars have a hard time with that. Because if you just assign that little section, oh, that's a P clause in the middle of a non-P verse, you have to like explain, like, well, what is it doing there? Like, how did it get? Why? So there's a lot of discussion of that. It's I think chapter 6, verse 5.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
immediately we can say that's redactor, but yeah, that's not fair,
Mm-hmm,
I would say.
mm-hmm. The metaphor that I like to use when we see things like that, it's kind of like if someone brings you a Rubik's Cube. Is that what you call it in your country? Do you know what I'm talking about? A Rubik's Cube?
Yes, Rubik, yeah,
Yeah, okay. Because I know here in Israel they call it a Hungarian cube. I'm not sure why. Maybe Rubik's was Hungarian. Okay, but you know what I want to make sure that
yeah, yeah, yeah,
okay, yeah. Oh, and if if
sure.
if if your audience are English speakers, they'll know what a Rubik's cube is. Okay, so let's say I bring you a Rubik's cube and I say, "Here, look, Nemanja, I solved the Rubik's cube," and you look it over and you say, "But, Dr. Berman, here on the red side, there's a green dot. You didn't solve the Rubik's cube." And I say, "Oh, no, 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 that's just a manufacturing error." Like, no, the simple thing to say is, oh, there's something wrong with my theory if I have a green dot on the red side, right? So if I suddenly have, a P clause in the non-P source, what does it all mean? Okay. That's just I have about 10 problems that I have with the source critical theory of the flood. It's in okay, you said something about promoting books, so I'll promote a book here. So I have a book called Inconsistency in the Torah, Ancient Literary Convention, and the Limits of Source Criticism. That's the academic version of it from Oxford. It costs a lot of money. So if you don't have it, and you don't have a library, it might be hard to get hold of. I have a more popular version of this book written for a Jewish audience called Ani Ma'amin. I know that's a mouthful if you don't know Hebrew. Ani Ma'amin, Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith, kind of a catechism written by Maimonides, a great Jewish scholar. I mentioned both of those books because in each I have this analysis of the Genesis flood account, presenting the source critical view, and then showing, in my humble opinion, 10 methodological flaws in that approach. So this is one of them that, when you have something that doesn't fit, do you say, oops, I have to go back to the drawing board because that doesn't fit? Or do you just say, oh, no, no, we're going to take that green dot on the red side and we're going to put that in quarantine and call that the redactor. Okay.
Oh yeah, a great example. I will remember this
Yeah.
now on. So yeah, my next question is, do we find examples in the ancient Near Eastern texts where a single author writes in a two or more different styles? For example, alternating between narrative and poetry or something else?
Yes. Yes, the Code of Hammurabi varies in styles. The prologue and the epilogue are totally different than the laws themselves. In these Kaddish inscriptions that I mentioned before from Ramses II, oh my gosh, it goes back and forth between narrative and poetry without, and you can't even like, there's no like indication of a break. It just it flows back and forth. Yeah, lots of things like that. Yep.
And what about different theology? Because we have in Deuteronomy a different theology from the Exodus and the other.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's a lot of different theological points in Deuteronomy relative to the other parts of the Pentateuch. Um, um, so as I see it, the book of Deuteronomy is Moses in the 40th year addressing the Israelites. I mean, that's just what it says. Okay. I mean, I'm not talking about, is that actually historically what it is? I'm just saying, how does Deuteronomy present itself? Okay. So that's how Deuteronomy is presenting itself. And what I believe is happening in Deuteronomy is that Moses is taking God's word from earlier in the Pentateuch, and he is reformulating it for a new generation, reapplying it. That is, my claim is that the Word of God in, let's say, Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers, the Word of God is not the last word, it is the first word. And the Torah's implicit message here is that things change over time, cultures change, needs change, times change. And therefore, how we execute God's will is going to change as well. And so what we see is Moses updating all sorts of updating laws and retelling stories with new and different emphases than their original tellings. Every story that Moses tells in Deuteronomy, and he tells five major stories in Deuteronomy, contradicts the earlier versions. Contradicts. If you're just looking at, the facts of the story, they contradict just like Ramses' inscriptions does. And I can point to other examples. In my book, Inconsistency, I have other examples of this as well. Because again, nobody was concerned with what is the ultimate 100% historical truth. And it was fully expected that when you refer to the past, when you talk about something that happened, you're going to stylize it and embellish it for the sake of the current audience. This happens everywhere, everywhere. People were not writing or reading these texts with the same assumptions that we read and write about the past today.
All right. Now, does some scholars sometimes forget that a person can change from over time? Let's say if I write something today and after 40 years or 20, I change
Yeah,
as a
that's
person.
true, but
Yeah.
that's already a kind of a diachronic argument. Oh, there was Nemanja, when he was, a wild high school student, and here is Nemanja, as a father with children and married and all, whatever it might be. You know what I mean? So yeah, we all change. I don't know what never said how that might impact anything that we see in the Bible, though. I don't think we know we actually don't know of, for sure who wrote any of these books from an academic perspective, let alone, oh, this one wrote this when he was young and this he wrote when he was old. So I'm not sure really how much that helps us, that analogy.
Fair enough, but even if we accept documentary hypothesis or anything else, we should at least, I think, agree that some material comes from Moses because Torah in itself says that Moses wrote something. Do you agree with that?
Look, the Torah says that Moses wrote certain things is incontrovertible. That's what it says. Okay. Is that historically true? So I can see why scholars might have some, might come to some different conclusions about this. Um, um, uh, the truth is that the Torah does not really say that Moses wrote. It says Moses, God spoke to Moses the following things, etc. There are some things that it says that Moses wrote down. It doesn't say that Moses wrote down the Torah itself. Okay. I might take that as an article of faith to some degree, especially with regard to certain parts. I think the best way to determine the age of any text really is to begin philologically. Can we do careful analysis of the historical linguistics of a text? Do we see many iterations or influences of texts from a certain period in the text that we're looking at in the Bible? These are the things I think that give some external control. There's a new book by a Cambridge scholar named Aaron Horncole, and he's an historical linguist. And his new book, it's a free download. So unlike my book, which costs a fortune, which is in my mind extremely valuable in terms of what it has to teach us, extremely technical. But if you can make your way through it, his claim is that the language of the Torah, meaning the five books, the Pentateuch, in literally hundreds of places, can be demonstrated to be the oldest linguistic profile of Hebrew of any book in the Torah. That's his claim. Now, that doesn't date it to Moses. It just suggests that the language is earlier than the language of other books. And
Amazing.
that's the claim in short. Yeah, this is a new book. This came out in October of 24.
Yes, but even critical scholars would say that Book of Samuel are 10th century or something like that. So if
Right.
this is
And he
older,
would
yeah,
he would
at
say
least,
that's right. Yeah, older. Yeah.
yeah. So what do you say about those arguments when people say, "Oh, Moses is addressed in a third person," and also Joshua ben Nun and others? So it seems like somebody later than those guys wrote Torah.
I don't get it. I don't understand the claim. Look. The I'll just give a modern example. Okay. Let me give a little bit of context here. It's an American example. Okay. So in America, we have the Supreme Court. Okay. The Supreme Court, that's like the highest level of court of justice in the United States. And there are nine Supreme Court justices. Now, the way things work in the United States is that people bring cases come before the Supreme Court, and the court hears the presentations, and then they spend amongst themselves many, many months deliberating, and their clerks look things up. They never rule on the spot. Okay, they might hear a case in the fall, but all of the decisions by the Supreme Court of the United States, almost all of them are issued in June. Every year, June. And there'll be one after another, one day after another. Oh, the Supreme Court today ruled, the Supreme Court today ruled. Now, why do I mention this? When you read the decisions, okay, the way in which those Supreme Court justices write is they say, today the court has decided, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And today there will be the date of whatever it is in June. But obviously, these things were written long before. Okay. That's the style. Okay. So if your purpose is to, there's a narratological difference between describing something in third person and describing it in first person. And so, the way in which the Torah wants to present Moses is to write about it in the third person. There's nothing that theoretically should block Moses from writing that in that way in the third person. If you can write a book about Nemanja and write about Nemanja, can't you do that? You can do that
Yeah,
because
why
if
not?
if you want people to view the story that you're writing about yourself objectively or at a distance, then you're going to do that. And if you want them to experience your inner life, then you'll write in the first person.
Yeah, to be honest, I never understand that argument as a
Okay.
hard or anything. But
Oh,
yeah,
I
just
thought
ask.
you were gonna say you never thought of writing a book about yourself. But okay, that's
Oh,
fine.
yeah. Okay, but we have passages from Torah that says before kings of Israelite.
Yeah,
Israelite kings, and there was no prophet like Moses. So you need some time, centuries, to reflect on those
right.
issues.
Could
So
be. Right, right. Could be. So some people might claim that. Yeah, legitimate.
yeah, so would you say that those are just comments, but not all Torah was centuries after Moses?
Hard to know. Certainly, statements like the ones you mentioned suggest that they are written after the life of Moses. That's certainly
Hmm.
true.
Yeah.
What
Okay,
what the
so
Torah
that's
what the Torah clearly says, again, is it historically accurate or not is a different question. But what the Torah clearly says is that all of the commandments that we have in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, these were dictated to Moses by God. Again, is that really what happened? That's a separate question. What does the Torah say? That is what the Torah says.
hmm, yeah, great distinction. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. Now, do duplicates or doublets indicate multiple sources? Why would a single author repeat a narrative in such a way that each of these narratives, when separated, results in two complete, uninterrupted, and internally consistent stories regarding the key questions: who, when, why, and how? For example, we talked about flood stories. So,
Um, I don't believe so. Um, uh, as I said, you can tell different stories a number of times for different purposes. I will say, um, the earliest Bible critic that we know about. By that I mean someone who came with the agenda of saying, this is not by Moses. There must be more than one hand involved in writing this work. The first person to do that uh, was in a systematic way was actually a Muslim theologian named Ibn Hazm in the 11th century. It's not Spinoza. Okay. Ibn
I
Hazm
thought
had
Spinoza, honestly. Yeah.
no, so I know that's what most people think. And I'm telling you that what I'm telling you about is 600 years earlier and in Arabic. Okay. And what Ibn Hazm did, you see, he was threatened. He, as a good Muslim, believed that, the Quran is the word of God and all written by the prophet. But even Muslims knew that the Torah had quite a good reputation and quite an antique reputation. And so he felt threatened by this. Now, there are other traditions in Islam that view the Torah with greater reverence than he has, but he had no reverence for the Torah. He rips it apart. He calls Jews, the anti-Semitism in his introduction there, it's equal to anything in the 20th century anywhere. Okay. Now, I mention him because he writes for about 100 pages about the signs that he sees, evidence that he sees in the Torah of the Torah having been written by more than one hand. So he finds everything that is a contradiction. Okay. Nowhere does he identify doublets, repetitions, as signs of repetition, as signs of multiple authorship. That is, even though his stated aim was to demonstrate that the Torah could not have been written by one person, he never points to the things that are doubled as evidence of this. What does that tell you? It tells you that literary unity is in the eye of the beholder, and literary disunity, and what constitutes what scholars call a fissure in the text, is in the eyes of the beholder. And here's a guy who was looking, and he really does a very good job of finding everything that is internally inconsistent, like really contradictory, but never identifies doublets as a reason for saying this couldn't have been by one person. And so it shows you that these things are culturally dependent. Perhaps part of the reason that Ibn Hazm wasn't bothered by repetitions as a sign of literary unity is because the Quran is full of repetitions. But it points to the same sort of thing. What determines whether a piece of literature has unity or not is all going to be culturally dependent. And if you only know from Aristotle and what he wrote in the Poetics, then you don't really have that understanding.
Amazing. I didn't know that, so thank you. And
Yep.
is it possible that maybe one author used many traditions and sources that are older from
Sure.
maybe, yeah,
Sure.
centuries
Look.
before?
Yeah, look, let me say something about the notion of authorship. So in our time, we think an author can only write original work. Uh, if you write something and it's too similar to something that someone else wrote, then we call that plagiarism, right? But this is a very modern way of thinking about authorship. Maybe 200 years old, not more than that. Certainly in medieval times and certainly in ancient times, if you are writing something, the last thing you want to do is be original all the time. You are part of a tradition. The way in which you contribute to the tradition is by demonstrating your mastery of the classics that have come before and your use of them. And so you're supposed to copy and you're supposed to incorporate other things. That's part of being part of a living tradition. But that's not a modern way of thinking about things.
Yes, in even 19th century, we have in our church SDA tradition, Ellen White, he used material from other commentators, and some say today, oh, that's plagiarism. But in that time, that was not because they
That's right.
wanted to use more materials from others.
That's
Yeah,
right.
to save
That's right.
yeah
Yep.
time. Or,
Hmm.
Okay, so is it possible that author wanted to preserve different stories and traditions, and that's the reason why he included all those, for example, two stories of flood. So one author preserves all two stories, but that's not separate sources, as source critics would say.
I don't think there are two flood stories. I think the flood story
Oh,
has unity. Okay, that's about the flood story. I think that you're on stronger terms to ask about creation. Creation clearly has two creation stories, I think.
okay.
Um, um, in theory, someone could say that, yeah, there were different traditions and they wanted to preserve both. Could be. Could be that it's
Mhm.
like what I said about the Kaddish inscriptions, wanting to tell a story two different ways to give two different sets of messages. Clearly, I would say, as I mentioned before, the preservation of the Gospels, I think, is a recognition of wanting to preserve different traditions that were already considered holy or having had currency in their time. Clearly, the canonization of the Old Testament, including both Samuel and Kings on the one hand and Chronicles on the other, is also a desire to maintain different traditions, even though at many, many points, Chronicles is different than Samuel and Kings.
Yeah, amazing. So you're open to this these options, yeah.
Yeah, but as I say, I'm more open to it in the differences between different books rather than within one story and then kind of looking to separate out. I'm more open to this when I see that the way in which the materials have been preserved preserves them as separate, right? There's two accounts of creation. They're separate. It's when we begin to say, oh, well, they were woven together, that's when I have a hard time.
Oh, yeah. But in flood story, we have a command from God that Noah take animals, and in one story, it is at least the source critics would say that he pick one pair of animals, and in other seven, and in each of that section, it says that Noah listened to Lord or God. So how do you don't see the two stories?
Right. So some want to say that the seven are only of the clean animals and they're for sacrifices. In other words, he's being told to do two different things. To bring the animals into the ark just to preserve them was pairs. And then in addition to that, he had to bring into the ark animals for sacrifices. And that's the clean animal.
Oh,
And that's the seven.
yeah. So that's intentional. Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. So next question about the Book of Deuteronomy. When would you date that book? The majority of scholars believe that it was written around 5th or to 7th century BCE, with possibility of some earlier sections. On the other hand, Kenneth Kitchen argues in his three-volume work Treaty, Law, and Covenant that Deuteronomy must belong to the second millennium BC. So what arguments would you provide to support your position?
Yeah, so Kitchen's arguments make a lot of sense to me. Um, There's many other things as well, and I want to be conservative here. I want to be careful. There's the question of when does it receive its final form? That's one question. A separate question is there evidence of early material? Because there could be early material, but it's only receives its final form later, right? And so the question of when is it written, it's not like, the books of mine that I've mentioned, in the year that I wrote them, they appeared. They didn't exist beforehand, okay? But maybe the books of scripture aren't that way. Maybe they existed in different forms across a long period of time and they reached their final form. So you can't just ask always, when was such and such a book written? Now, I think that there's a lot of evidence for things that are very early in Deuteronomy. The things the kitchen mentions are some of them. Um, when you look at the geopolitical situation described in Deuteronomy, where's Babylon? Where's Assyria? No, what Deuteronomy talks about is seven little countries, seven little city-states in Israel that don't exist by the time you get to the 7th century BC. Um, uh, the whole socioeconomic situation in Deuteronomy. You have little farmers living on their land. There's no trade. There's no big cities. There's no sale contracts. No trade. That describes an earlier period. You look at the level of literacy that Deuteronomy presupposes. That is that there's very little literacy. That you have to teach people by heart the Song of Moses, for example. Um, uh, that also fits with the earlier period. I mentioned the linguistic argument that Hornkohl raises earlier. There's much evidence, linguistic evidence in Deuteronomy that the language of Deuteronomy is earlier than, let's say, any of the writing prophets that we have from the, 8th and 7th and 6th centuries. Um, what else can I mention? The fact that Deuteronomy has no idea of Jerusalem, doesn't exist. Zion doesn't exist. It's very surprising that those things are absent if this is written in those later years. It's incredible that the uh, um, um, the chapter of rebuke, Deuteronomy 28, all those curses and all the destruction that's going to happen, and there's no mention of the temple. Like, that doesn't make sense, if you're talking about an era where the destruction of the temple is beginning to come into view. So all these things, it seems to me, point to things that are early in Deuteronomy. Let's leave it that way.
Yes, they would for sure say that temple would be destroyed if they're unfaithful. Yeah, so it makes sense, really.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so why don't we have in minor prophets, at least early ones, as Amos, Hosea, Micah from 8th, 9th century? They don't even quote entire Torah, Exodus and others. So why is
Um,
that?
I'm not sure of that. That is to say, quote, nobody quotes, nobody's, well, let's say following the return, to Jerusalem, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles. So there you have often the phrase, as it is written in the word in the book of Moses or in the book of God, referring to the Torah, or as written in the Torah of Moses or the Torah of God. That phrase appears much, much less in earlier books. But what you do have is in all the books all the earlier books, paraphrasing of various verses and stories that we have in the Pentateuch. So the Torah plays a different role in the Second Temple period than it did in the First Temple period. In the First Temple period, if you wanted to know God's will, you went to the prophet of that time. That's the most up-to-date version of what God wants from the Israelite people. It's when prophecy ends with the return to Zion. Well, how are we going to know what God wants? That's where there's a quantum leap from prophecy to midrash, to study of the text. And that's why you have, time after time in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Oh, what was done here was what is as it is written in the Torah of Moshe, or the Torah of God. And oftentimes a kind of midrash on those terms. In other words, the Torah takes the place of prophecy. That's what happens in the Second Temple period.
All right, makes sense to me. But many believe that Deuteronomy was written during the reign of King Josiah when the priest Hilkiah, sorry, how to say,
Yeah.
discovered the Book of the Law in the temple in Jerusalem. Can you argue that the text in 2 Kings 22 to 23 most likely indicates that the Book of the Law existed before that time, but internal evidence may be based on some prophets or books from the period before King Josiah, rather than being newly composed at that time?
Right. So, I mean, what it says is that the Torah was discovered. Now, if you just kind of roll your eyes and say, oh, that's just, a cover for the authorship of the Torah at that time. Nadav Ne'eman, a very well-known Israeli scholar of the previous generation, he has an article where he shows this motif is actually in a lot of cultures. This was not uncommon that people would be wandering around the archives and suddenly discover an ancient text of great importance. This happens. And it wasn't because it was just written at that moment. Like this happened. These sorts of things happened. And as I
Okay,
said
and
before, other things that seem to suggest that Deuteronomy is earlier. I said there's no mention of Jerusalem, no mention of the temple, there's no mention of the Davidic king. That's really strange. I mean, if we're talking about the seventh century and there's already been a Davidic king for like 3 or 4 centuries, and we know the role that the Davidic king plays in all these books that are from those centuries. I mean, where's David? Where's the Davidic king? Why don't we find that in Deuteronomy?
yeah, amazing. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, no Zion theology at all. So
Right, right,
that's
right.
weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
the absence of Zion theology, that's the argument of my friend and colleague John Bergsma of Franciscan University in the US.
oh yeah, great mind.
Yeah,
I love him.
a great Catholic scholar. Great scholar.
Hmm. Do you have any conclusion, Dr. Berman? What to say to audience about all
Well,
this?
yeah, I think that well, many of us, I think you and I, and probably many of your audience, because they probably resonate to the type of ideas and approach that you're giving here on the channel, are looking for a fusion of spiritual and intellectual integrity. And when you read scholarly works by, and they're almost always very good scholars, and they say things that are very challenging, all I would say is there's almost nothing that has consensus today in biblical scholarship. There's always another view. That doesn't mean the other view is correct. And it doesn't mean that there isn't a dominant view. But I would say that to almost anything that one can find challenging, if you look hard enough, look around, see if there are different views. I'm not even talking about different theological ways of dealing it. That's also true. But there's an awful lot goes on in biblical scholarship which might be based on assumptions that we have as moderns, but are not necessarily assumptions that pre-moderns or ancients would have had. So all I would say is that take the work of Kenneth Kitchen, or you mentioned my friend and colleague Richard Averbach. Um, it's worth, if there's something that you're struggling with, ask around to friends, mentors who might have more knowledge in the field, and see if there are other views that perhaps could be compelling. We don't want to just find the view that accords with my belief. We want things, as I said, that are spiritual, have spiritual integrity, but also intellectual integrity. But not necessarily the first thing that pops up on your screen will be the only answer that's out there, the only approach that's out there.
Incredible advice. Thank you. Yeah, I
Yeah,
agree. Strong faith in the Bible and critical mind and open to new ideas.
yep,
So yeah, I
yep,
like that.
yep, yep.
Okay, Dr. Rabbi Joshua Berman, thank you
Okay.
for sharing your deep insights into complexities of biblical authorship and ancient literary conventions.
Okay.
We Yeah, we appreciate your time and expertise, and we look forward to a future conversation on these fascinating topics. So thank you for coming, and God bless you.
Okay, friends. Blessings from the Holy Land. All the best.